I have an interface here that just describes generic CRUD operations. And what we'll be taking a look at is how we can bridge the gap between an HTTP client and making CRUD operations inside of a C# program. I have implementations for all of these generic service methods down here, and I've also got an empty controller here. There is only one method and it's not implemented yet. The goal is to get to a point where we can have an HTTP client like a browser, send requests to our API, and trigger all of these CRUD operations that we have. So what we like to be able to do is take an HTTP client like a browser and be able to actually request data using the web-preferred way of requesting data. So if you have a client application, the client application can request some kind of entity, maybe make an operation like ordering by or getting an entity by some kind of an ID, and then the API should be able to recognize what it is the client wants. And we have 3 entities. So there are some patients, there are some diseases, and there are some diagnoses here. And currently, we have a controller method here that is responding to a request to get patients. So this one we can implement really quickly by just making a variable here called patients, and then just calling the service and using the getAll method here, and then just describing that it is the patient type we want here. So currently, this one just gets all of patients. Because the actual result is our return type, we can't just write return patients and be okay with it. We need to actually use a status code. You can just use status code 200 to indicate that this is a successful response here. And now I'm going to just open up the terminal, and then I'll just rerun the program here. And in order to actually send a request to get to this point here, we'll need to prefix it using this syntax here. So I'll put in the base address and then write API and then hospital and then patients. And now I'll get a list of the patients. So currently there are 2 patients here. So this is nice and simple, right? We're calling a service method. Service method says, here's all the patients, and it's returning it to the HTTP client. So it's serializing this as what we call JSON format. So let's do something that's slightly more challenging. Let's try and get a patient by an ID. So the getAll method that I created here also has filtering. So you can actually filter by ID. So you would just use a lambda expression here and write ID equals to some ID. So currently I just hard-coded 1 here. But how do we actually take this ID from the address bar? So let's say that I want to get patients and then /1. We need to actually capture this 1 here in order to get the patient number 1, Peter, out here. So what we can do to actually get the ID number 1 is to build it into the route here that there exists a route segment called ID. So this is just the name we gave it. We could call it anything here. And then inside of the parameters of the method, we just write from route. So now we get to make a variable here, and we need to name the variable accordingly with whatever route segment we named here. So if you call this patient ID, you should write int patient ID. You could also write string. Let's say that IDs are strings for some reason. That's also fine to do, but in this system, the ID is an integer. So you just write patient ID here, and let's trigger a rerun here. Now it's running again, and we'll go into our browser here and request patient number 1. And now we get Peter. Let's request patient number 2. Now we get Bob. So this works as intended. We're taking the route segment here, and we're injecting this one into the method. And using the model binding here, we're looking for the patient ID, and then we're just filtering by it. So this works as intended. But let's say you don't have a route segment. So maybe you have something like a query parameter. And inside of the browser, it looks something like this, where you specify a key. So the key could be ordered by, and then there could be a value like ordered by ID. So maybe you're just looking for all patients and you want to order them by ID. Or maybe you want to order them by name. Let's try to achieve this. Just remove the from route that we have here, because now I want to show how it looks like with all of the patients. So we'll just remove this as well. And now I'll use the attribute from query here. And then I'll define a string and give it a name. So the name could be ordered by. You don't have to specify up here that there exists a query parameter. Query parameters, they come after the route segments. And we don't need to do filtering here. We'll just put in null as the filter. And here, I'll just put in the order by. So the way ordering works for this method is that you have to actually specify the name of the property that you want to order by. So in this instance, we'll try with name, and then we'll try with ID and see if it works. So we'll rerun the program now. First of all, we'll just do all patients. So patients, and now we get Peter and Bob here. And then we'll try to do order by, and they will write name, and Bob is first. And they will try ID, and now Peter is first. Peter is of course first because his ID is not 1 and Bob's ID is 2. So now we're successfully taking a query parameter key and value, and now we are injecting it into the HTTP controller method here. And of course, there are other ways we can pass data. So one of the most common ways is using the HTTP request body. But we shouldn't be using request body when we're making a GET request. So I'm going to define an HTTP post controller method down here. I'm still going to write patients as the route. So patients. So now I'll just define the signature of the method here. Public action result. Patient as the generic type. And then I'll call it create patient. Currently, I don't have anything in here, and we need to actually pass in a patient object for creating a patient. So what I'll do here is I'll write from body. This indicates that you're using the HTTP request body in order to pass the data. And then you need to give it a type. So you would write the type here, this patient type, and then you can give it a name. So patient with the lowercase p is my variable here. And I'll delete some of this space. So in order to actually insert the patient into our database, I have a method called add. So on the service that I have up here, I just use the add method here, and then I pass in a patient. And then I just write return OK patient. So this is a very simple implementation. How do we test this when we can't test it from the address bar here, because the address bar sends GET requests? Well, a very simple way to do it is to just create a file that ends in .http. So out here, I'll just create a file, and then I'll just write post patients.http, and then I'll write post HTTP localhost or 5000 API hospital patients. So once you have the address inserted here and the HTTP verb, you need to add a header, which is the content type. And it is application JSON. So we're sending a post request, and we're sending with a JSON object. So a patient has an ID and a name. So you would write ID, and then you could write maybe 3, and name, that could be John. So before we actually send it, I'll just rerun the API, because we've added more code. You need to always rebuild the API before we can actually use these things. And now we send a request here, and this is the response. We're getting the object back here. And that also means if you go in here and you get all the patients, now you also have John. So we know that the way of injecting the patient here works as intended. In this instance, we're using the exact same type object to send to the API as is the entity type. Typically, this is not actually desired to do. In our case, we're also specifying an ID ourselves. So something you would often do is you would create a specific model for transmitting this data. So you would write public class create patient DTO. And here you would only specify the properties required for creating a patient. So for instance, if you have IDs being generated at the database level, you don't put in an ID for the HTTP request because that ID is being generated further down the line. So here you can just write public string name, get set, and now I can put in create patient DTO here. And currently this will be valid because the add method here, it doesn't really care about type. But if you put in a patient type here, it's going to be angry with me because this doesn't really fit the patient here. So the solution here is just creating a new patient entity type and then just passing the name in here and then take the name from the patient DTO. I'll just rename it patient DTO. And now it works fine. You don't really need to have these. So this is actually redundant. It's just to show you that the DTO is not the same type as the patient entity. We're just using it to transport the data. So if I rerun my application now and open up the HTTP file that I have, leave out the ID, click run, I will now have another John here, and I will now have another John. The HTTP response doesn't actually include the ID. This is just me getting all of them. If you want to have the ID included, currently what you'd have to do is write this in a new line, var patients, or I'll just call it P, put in P here, and then return P. So if I rerun this now, we're not actually returning the patient DTO anymore, it's returning the actual patient object. So I'll go back into the HTTP file, click run here, and now I'll have John with ID 5, John with ID 6, John with ID 7, and so on. There is one more method that we typically use for injecting data into an HTTP request, and that is the headers. So here I'll just pass in another argument, and I'll write from header here, and now I can maybe write something like string authentication token, right? And let's say that if the authentication token is null or empty. So string is null or white space, return unauthorized. No token. So now let's actually try and see if we can trigger this one here. I'll just rerun the API. And now I'll go into the HTTP file that we have here. If I run this now, I should get a 401 response. And it says 401 unauthorized. But let's say I pass in a header, and the header is called authentication token. I think that's what I call it. And right now it can just be ABC. I send this, and now I get a 200 response. And we make another John here. So it works fine. This is just to show we have different ways of injecting data into an HTTP request. And therefore, the server application must also be capable of reading from the HTTP request, such that we can do something with the data. I'm going to leave a link for all of the code that I produced in this video in the description of the video. So if you're curious to see what the rest of the code looks like, you can check it out. But all of the essential things, they are inside of the controller class. And it's really about injecting data into an HTTP request, and then inside the controller class, trying to intercept all of that data. So taking route segments, taking query parameters, taking HTTP body value, taking HTTP header values, and then trying to use these for something tangible, and then making a response again. Thank you for watching.